A room without books is like a body without a soul.
Welcome to Sundoku, the podcast for people who know that books are the one thing you can buy that's guaranteed to make you richer. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Sarah Martin.
Sarah, what are you reading at the moment?
I've just decided to do a bit of a dive down into one of my favourite books of all time, which is Shantaram by Gregory David Roberts.
I've read it once, long ago. I loved it.
I don't know many people who don't go, it's one of those books. And I actually picked it up when we'd been travelling in India, and it just transported me back to all of the smells, the sounds, the vibe. You know, it just took me there in a heartbeat. And now I've gone back and read this book now 4 times.
And it's a big book, so that's no small thing.
It's not a small undertaking. And now if you're listening and you haven't picked up this book, it's written by Gregory David Roberts. It's his story with a lot of embellishment, I'm sure. He is a criminal who has broken out of jail. He was an armed robber. He's moved and run away to Mumbai in India and interestingly becomes essentially a slum doctor. He then gets connected to the mafia underbelly, and he just has this amazing rollicking ride through India, and it's just fascinating because it takes you right in there. So if you love an adventure book, if you love lyrical writing, it's one that you should pick up and read.
And I know you're never reading just one book. What else are you reading?
Yeah, now this one I did mention to Annie a couple of episodes ago, The Bee Sting by Paul Murray.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's fascinating. It's one that I really enjoyed, right to the end. And if anyone's read right to the end, there's a bit of disagreement amongst readers on how much love they've got once they get to the end of this book, but we'll let you read that for yourself. But what I love about it is it's written from different perspectives. So the father, Dickie, who's sort of had this traumatic upbringing, it's his wife, Imelda, and then it tells the stories of their daughter, Cassie, who's a young woman who's trying to break out into the world, go to college and sort of stand on her own 2 feet, and their young son, PJ, who's this 12-year-old, and he is probably my favourite because he's just written so perfectly in that naivety, trust and belief in the grown-ups around him.
It's a beautiful age.
Oh, and interestingly as well, what I liked about reading the book in a hard copy is that there was different formatting for each character. But one thing I've interestingly just been noticing is people are commenting on how glorious the audiobook is, which I imagine with all of the Irish accents and it would just be a gorgeous listen. So I guess the thing I've gained from reading it in looking at that formatting aspect, I may have lost in the audiobooks. I'm hoping to go back and listen to it that way.
Yeah.
And I know you're a big fan of audiobooks, Michaela.
I am. It's my latest thing. It's a bit of a craze. I actually am reading a real book at the moment. So I'm reading, with pages and everything.
Oh, wow.
I'm reading Dusk by Robbie Arnott because I'm interviewing him in a couple of days. And Limberlost, his book Before Dusk, was my favourite book of 2023. I absolutely loved it. So I decided to reread Limberlost through audio. So I'm actually taking the audio of Limberlost to the gym with me each morning and I'm having a listen. And the thing I'm loving about audiobooks is the acting. It's such an interesting craft, and I would love to speak to some actors who create audiobooks because, well, for example, in Limberlost, it's mostly the story of Ned, a boy, but there's a woman narrating the book. And as soon as I heard her voice, I thought this is going to be all wrong because it's a woman. But it's not. Her acting is sublime. And then another one I've just listened to on audio recently is 3 Wild Dogs and the Truth by Marcus Suzak, because I just interviewed him as well. So that'll be coming up on an episode soon. And actually what I did there is I read the first half of 3 Wild Dogs and the Truth by book, and then I listened to the second half of the book on audio because I wanted to see what it brought to it. And that one was narrated by Marcus Suzak. So no one else could have done it because it's such a personal story about his family and his 3 wild dogs. So I don't know. I just find it so interesting how audiobooks are created and whether they do them justice or not. And so far I've been on a good roll.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, I imagine there must be some that are just not quite right.
There must be. I don't think I've had a bad one yet. I've probably only listened to, 8 so far, and they've all been good. So there you go. Anyway, we should get on with what's happening on the program today. So today, Kath is going to catch up with super writer Sean Williams. Sean, he's South Australian, but his fame is worldwide, and he's a #1 New York Times bestselling author. He's always on the move. He's always creating something different. So he writes for children, for adults. He writes science fiction. He writes fantasy. And he's also actually written for the franchises Star Wars and Doctor Who. So that'll be a little later in the program. And Sarah, I think you're bringing us a couple of lovely titles. What have you got?
Oh, my goodness. I've just got an amazing couple of books. 2 fairly new books, actually. One is called Nightbitch. It's written by Rachel Yoder, and it is literally the story of a woman feeling like she's turning into a dog.
Okay.
It's amazing.
It works. I'll
works.
trust you on that one.
Trust me. And the other is All Fours by Miranda July. Now, Miranda July is sort of known as a bit of a creative. She's made documentaries. She's put herself in the picture.
Okay.
And with this book, it's known that she's tracked a bit of her own real life, exploring what it means to be going through menopause, not necessarily satisfied in the very good life that you live, and what you do to explore and expand that. And it's never quite sure how it lands on whether this is real life or a story. I think it's this mashing of both, and it's fascinating. So both are the stories of women trying to sort of find a different world from the one in which they live.
And now to Kath's chat with Sean Williams, author of 50 books and more than 100 short stories. Sean is captivated by fantasy and speculative fiction, and he loves ghost stories, and now he's even trying his hand at music. Writing's hard work, but seemingly not for Sean. Kath met up with him to find out how he does it.
You are probably the most prolific author that I have ever met, with the possible exception of Alexander McQuall Smith.
Oh, wow. Yeah, he's super prolific. You might have met some stealthy romance writers. They're extremely prolific, or self-published writers.
There's a thought. But my information tells me you have 4 million words published.
Well, I probably need to update that. That might
More
be
than
about 5 million.
5
So it's 60 novels now and 140 short stories. It's probably getting up towards 5 million now.
See, and
which
that
is
just
mad.
confirms my impression that you're not quite human.
Am I human? Am I human? I think I was just really, really desperate when I was younger not to have a real job, and I put inverted commas around real. I just wanted to be a writer, and that's all I wanted to do. And now I'm at Flinders University and have a full-time role there. That's got in the way of the writing a little bit. So I've slowed down a lot.
Okay, so if I go back to the last of your books that I've read, the latest series of books for readers, middle readers, whatever that means, so maybe, I don't know, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old readers.
10 and up.
Her Perilous Mansion and
Honour Among Ghosts.
Where it's a sort of haunted house fantasy, the first one, Her Perilous Mansion. You're asking an awful lot of brain work of the kids.
Am I good?
In that one. It confronted me, a lot of puzzles to solve.
Well, I like mysteries and I like ghosts, and I was reading a lot of... I always forget her name. She wrote the Grand Sophie Regency. She basically invented the Regency romance.
Georgette Heyer.
Georgette Heyer, thank you very much. I spent a year in Ireland in 2018, and all I read the entire year was all of her Regency romance novels, for the first time, one after the other.
You know, and they are so good.
They are so good, and they're so funny, and they're so descriptive, and they're so wonderful. So and while I was over there, I was writing Her Perilous Mansion, and I thought, I really want to dabble with this voice. You know, here I am writing something set in an Irish environment based on the big houses that I was seeing in Ireland. It didn't feel like my usual kind of stripped back voice would be enough. So I thought, let's do the Georgette Heyer voice, in as much as it's possible for me to emulate it, but to be inspired by her. And I was sort of worried that maybe that was too much for kids. But of course, you know, lots of other writers, kids writers like Garth Nix, are also in love with Georgette Heyer and Garth's voice. You can see that influence in his voice. So I kind of sort of trusted that kids would be okay with it. And that led me to thinking, well, maybe they'll be okay with puzzles and other stuff as well. And my editors seemed to think it was okay.
It was great. It did have that Irish flavour to it somehow.
Good.
Sort of banshee-ish almost, with
Yeah.
the voices in the pipes and the...
And the bells and the
And the
knocking and all that. Yeah, it was. And actually, I got the idea before I went to Ireland. It was an actually idea I pitched to Garth to say, hey, maybe you and I should write this together. He said, no, that's a good idea. You should write it. I've got nothing to add to it. And the idea of a magic spell gone wrong in a house that might be haunted. And I wasn't really planning to write it over in Ireland, but I was seeing all these big houses, and slowly the mansion started to take shape. And
became the main character.
Yeah, it did become the main character. I still remember the houses, like the kitchen of the mansion comes from a stately home called Lissadell House that we visited over there. I can still see the pieces, but hopefully it doesn't feel like a Frankenstein's monster of a house.
No, not at all. No. And you mentioned Garth Nix, and I think if I think back to when I first met you, and we talked about books you were writing. This is way back in the 90s, I suppose.
Oh, yeah.
And you and Garth were doing, what, Trouble Twisters? Is that?
Trouble Twisters, that probably didn't start till the 2000s. We met in 98, so maybe it was a little bit later than that. But we certainly met before that. We've been having many conversations for 25 years and more now. We've covered a lot of ground. But yes, our first series was Trouble Twisters, and then we did a book in another kids series, all kids books. And we're thinking about doing something new at the moment for adults, though, maybe.
Great that you're still getting on and collaborating, and things still keep coming together between you. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, your own trophy shelf has become more and more, ever more loaded. And I suppose if people are trying to describe you in 25 words or less, they say speculative fiction / fantasy writer, but you've kind of hired yourself out as a gun to the Marvel universe, the Star Wars universe, the Doctor Who universe.
Yes, and I like doing realist stuff too. So the novel before on Her Perilous Mansion was set in Adelaide in the present day with no weirdness. It was. I get really restless. I like to try lots of different things, whether they're my own things or in collaboration with other people or in other people's play boxes. But I do really enjoy trying something new all the time. So writing Impossible Music about a boy who goes deaf, I didn't want to do anything weird or strange with that. I wanted to explore my love of music, and my next book is in a similar kind of vein. Nothing weird or strange. It's about a kid stuck in Antarctica in the present day. And I find these books a lot harder to write. I think not because they're more difficult necessarily, but I think because I have less practice at them.
Yeah.
My instinct is always to throw in something super weird and super strange, but
you have to hold back.
Well, it's not a matter of holding back. It's a matter of just wanting to try things that I haven't done before. I could write books about haunted houses with ghosts for the rest of my life, and I'd probably get better and better at them. And so there's nothing wrong with doing that. But I kind of go, I've sort of done that. I feel like I've conquered that challenge. Let's try something different and strange, and that'll make my life harder. Why not?
Well, speaking of new worlds into which you might venture, the continent of Antarctica is the one that you just mentioned a minute ago, and you went there. And that is where you are wanting to write. And in fact, I heard from another friend today that you were applying to go there again to winter.
Yes. So I went down as an Australian Arts Fellow through the Australian Antarctica program, which is an incredible gift that's available for artists of any kind in Australia that want to do something Antarctica themed. I was very lucky to go there in 2017, but I didn't go there for long enough. And I became aware, talking to other arts fellows and thinking about my experiences down there, that most people go in summer because that's when it's easy to get to and from. And if something goes wrong, they can airlift you out or get you out on the boat. And very few people have experience of Antarctica in the winter. And I like the cold, so I loved Antarctica down there. And I really like the dark as well. So I thought, well, a winter would be great. Let's do that. Let's go down there. 10 months away from home gave me some pause.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's a long way. And I applied 3 times because it's a huge amount of resources required to keep somebody alive in Antarctica for 10 months and alive and sane. So they wanted to make sure that I would have plenty to do and that my projects aligned. And I ended up having this huge grab bag of stuff to do down there, including novels and music and podcasts. And I was going to teach from down there as well. Nobody had done that before.
Wow.
And I got the approval in the end and was scheduled to go down in a particular year. But I didn't pass the medical. So I have heartburn. And one thing they can't treat down there is an ulcer. So I kind of need to get over that hurdle before they'll let me go. So I'm still hopeful I'll be able to winter down there as the first Australian writer to winter down there and see what it's like. We'll see. one day. Because they say you get the ice in your veins. And I've certainly got the ice in my veins. And I went down there to do one thing and I came back having done 5 things and knowing that I wanted to do another 25 things.
Well, how did that ice in your veins come out in ink for this new novel?
Well, I've been doing a lot of writing on the subject ever since. So within a week of coming back, I wrote a piece of flash fiction, which was published. I wrote a short story for Griffith Review on their special Antarctica issue. The story I went down there to write will be coming out as a novella next year. That's my Douglas Mawson meets the War of the World's Martians story in Antarctica.
Right.
Which that reaction is the reaction my wife gets to, you know. Douglas Mawson, why not just stick with Douglas Mawson? Why do you have to put Martians in it? Because I want to. You know? And the one for next year is I've been thinking about that for years now. I've wanted to write a kids' book set in Antarctica, but it's very, very hard to get kids down there. Kids can't. Well, it's very hard to get anybody who's not in the program onto an actual base, but getting kids into Antarctica for any length of time is quite difficult. So working that out was the first hurdle, and then working out what the story would be about is something I'm still working on now, but I'm hoping to write it next year.
All right. And did you say earlier that a kid is stranded?
Yeah,
in Antarctica?
Separated from his family, on his own, surrounded by adults, no other children. The only person his age has got to talk to is his sister, who died 2 years earlier in a TikTok challenge, who kind of haunts his mind as a voice talking to him, and haunts the social media he has had access to on the phone. And he needs to kind of separate from his grief and reconnect with his father back on the mainland through his clarifying experiences in Antarctica. Because everything's sort of dangerous and deadly and complicated down there, but it's also incredibly clarifying in ways that really surprised me. And the landscape, of course, is much simpler than anything on the mainland. But the people down there all share a common love of Antarctica and its well-being. And it simplifies life in very powerful ways that I'm hoping to riff on in this book with this poor kid.
Fantastic. Well, interesting, because it sounds as though you're putting that character through a sort of psychic tests that in a way and in a light-hearted way you do in Perilous Mansions, because the main character is called Etta, and that's short for regret.
Yes.
And she has 12 siblings, all of whom have names that shorten to something that's innocuous, but they haven't had a happy upbringing, but they're managing as strong individuals in their own right, but kind of divorced really from parental support.
That's right. As 13 daughters of a man who wanted a son but never got one, and every child is named after his melancholy or regret or
misery.
Misery, that's right, Missy. Yes. It was quite hard finding 13 synonyms for this sentiment. But yes, that sense of loss and not belonging to a family, not being valued, is something, yes, that I'm exploring again. Kids books and science fiction do this very, very well. I'm not saying that other genres don't do it, but that sense of finding yourself, that coming of age, that search for identity and selfhood is something that I love about these genres and these forms. I mean, it's the coming of age story is you know, of course that's what we think about when we think about kids books and YA novels. Maybe not so much with science fiction, but I love the matter transmitter trope, the beam me up Scotty trope, and that's what my PhD is on. And I keep coming back to that idea, because once you go through one of those machines, the question is, am I still the same person on the other side? And that search for identity and surety of self is embedded in those stories too.
Well, I think with your writing career, that must be a question for you, because you must have to kind of compartmentalise your brain to do the various writing tasks that you set it.
Yes, and I'm not very good at that at the moment, because I'm teaching and trying to write around the edges. And I'm also making music now as well. So this sort of ambient music with very little melody, very little visible structure, almost like a non-identity Zen kind of space. So I think this is me responding to those demands put on me by my other jobs, and reacting and go, no, I'm going to make one sound for 3 hours and call it an album. I think that's a subconscious reaction to that.
Wow. And the other thing I always think about you is how generous you are with your time, and you wouldn't think there would be much of it left over, but you do. You collaborate, you're at literary events, you're doing your work with the creative writing program. You just seem to... the trope of writers shutting themselves up in an attic to write would probably not apply to you.
Oh, it still does. That is my natural instinct. And COVID was actually very, very bad for me, because I loved isolating and being away from everybody, except for my wife and family. I really, really liked it. And I found it very, very hard to come out of it. And I still feel the effects of that. My favourite place will always be at home, locked in my study, doing something in the dark, or just hanging out with Amanda. That is my preferred place. So I find it quite hard to get out. And as I'm getting older, I'm getting tireder, and I still love people. I still feel really energized. Last night I was at the State Library's drinks for the judges of the State
Literary Awards.
South Australian Literary Awards, And that was marvellous and wonderful to see so many friends and meet new people. It's great, but there's a hurdle to get over. I don't know whether you feel this, Kath, but it's sometimes you think, I really should go to this launch and I love these people, but it'd be nice to stay home. So I constantly feel a sense of guilt that I'm not doing enough. But I also figure I've done a lot of it in the past.
Oh, I think you could rest on your laurels a bit.
I think people know I love them.
I think they probably do. And I think maybe my last question would be, since you are getting to that stage of wise elder, and you've got so many words to look back on, and such a wide oeuvre, does it now seem to you that there are preoccupying themes that are bubbling up all the time for you?
Yes, totally. I can see phases of this in the past now, because I can look back 30 years and go, well, look, my first 15 novels were all about found fatherhood and complicated father-son relationships, because that's what I was going through for a lot of my life. And my latest novels that are all about finding oneself, really reflects the challenges I faced when I started getting chronic pain in my hands and neck, and was thinking that maybe I'd have to give up writing. And then what did that make me after that? If I can't write, what does that make me? So I think I can definitely see recurring themes coming out through my writing. I'm still in the finding myself phase. At some point I will come out of that. And that might come around retirement. I sort of expect when I step away from my real job teaching, which I'm not planning to do anytime soon, there'll become a new kind of disconnect. I won't be a writer who's pursuing dollars anymore, sort of driven by markets to a certain extent. I can do whatever I want, and that'll be a wonderful position to be in. And I don't know what will emerge then. Maybe I'll be writing about, am I still relevant? Maybe that'll be my great crisis, and that'll be fine. Maybe I'll just start putting novels back in the drawer like I did when I was younger.
That was author and literary academic Sean Williams talking to Sundoku's own Kath Keneally. Sean Williams' latest releases are Her Perilous Mansion and Honour Among Ghosts. But watch out for one featuring the Antarctic sometime soon.
You're listening to Sundoku, the podcast for addicted readers. We're happy to be bringing back some chats with our classics ladies, Lisa Bennett and Kylie Cardell, and you'll hear a few of those scattered across the next few episodes. This is a conversation I had with Kylie Cardell. She's Associate Professor at Flinders University's College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. And we discussed two books that are both wild and creative, and yet so solidly set in the experiences that women are going through in significant stages of their lives. And so here we go. We're going to discuss Nightbitch by Rachel Yoder and All Fours by Miranda July.
I think there's a label we could give these books, and I think it's art versus mother books. And so this is a really interesting genre, and not actually that recent, actually quite an old genre explored by lots of women writers about how to be creative and maintain an internal life of, aliveness and creativity and newness in the face of the reality of mothering, being a wife or partner, and the need to live a daily life within the structures of life available to women, which in the modern world are quite free, but also not necessarily that different. And particularly for those women who want to or find the call of an artistic, creative life as another kind of aspect of their personality. So there's a really big tension here, and this book's explore it. Miranda July's book is kind of set at a perimenopausal moment. She's quite strong about that, so their character is 45, whereas Rachel Yoder's book is a young mother who's, I think, in about her 30s, but again, times of identity shift, maybe even great renewal in terms of effacement, like who am I, is a question these women are asking themselves. But they've had a life, they've had a very strong identity, and all of a sudden they're trying to find a new one, or they're being forced to.
In both novels, actually, the children are of that young age.
True.
They're aged about 3, 4, and so it is that time where the mothers have given up or found that tension between their own self and that identity loss that you have. Yeah. More so with a child than you do with a partner.
Yeah, absolutely. Although they're all equally competing pressures in some ways. And maybe one of them is just less negotiable. The child is obviously unable to kind of, manage a relationship in the way that an adult human should be able to. And yet the incapacity of those human relationships, the adult relationships, to sustain parenting and nurturing and that phase of life is a big theme in both of these books. And who does that? Who bears the burden of it? And the cost is a subtext as well.
And interestingly, each then diverges significantly in the approach that it takes.
Yeah, though they're both quite wild and unhinged, gloriously unhinged books, extremely creative. But I think it's quite interesting. Maybe we'll get to this again as well, but there's a fairy tale aspect to both of these books. And I think one of them is more obvious. So in Nightbitch, we have an actual transformation of the main character, or we think it is. It might be happening inside her extremely sleep-deprived brain. And that is not something to dismiss, right? The context of Nightbitch is a young mother who is very, very sleep deprived. And in fact, I remember giving this book to a friend and then realising they probably shouldn't be reading it because they were still in that stage of life. And it is a very incredibly good depiction of what it feels like to be very sleep deprived, overwhelmed, in love. And there's no shortage of love for the child, but also an incredible survival. She's surviving at this point in time. The main character in Nightbitch doesn't have a name, but it's called the mother, this kind of archetypal figure. And so the mother is raising her child and sleep deprived and living out her life, has had a very creative, successful career, in fact has had her dream job. And suddenly, in the context of this new world where her sole main focus is caring for the child, strange things start to happen to her. Her teeth become sharper. She gets hair in strange places, unwanted hair that she doesn't know what to do with. And in fact, she thinks she's turning into a dog. And that is her literal feeling. And some things in the book play that out. So she goes roaming at night. She starts to eat raw meat. There's these kind of really fantastical, crazy things. And you can think of that as a fairy tale in that there's a kind of suspension of reality here, right? There's a kind of strange supernaturalness happening. In All Fours, the fairy taleness is the mother, in this context, leaves behind a child who's a bit older, about 6 years old, leaves behind a husband, and goes on a road trip. So again, a liminal, transformative kind of moment happening, and manages to procure for herself a room of her own, a hotel room that does not belong to her, but that she puts a lot of money into making her own, creating a kind of castle, I guess, or a space where she feels like she can be herself and she can escape from the world for a while. So both of these books have at their centre a mother who has kind of been pushed to the limits of experience and is now in a kind of weird, fantastical place where anything can happen, and then what's going to happen next.
And then what's happening to each of them?
Happening to each of them?
In both of them? Well, it is that those fantastical experiences are reinforced by their engagements with others and the texts that they read and the people they meet, and they sort of are encouraged to explore that, and whether that's their need for release and they hook onto it. But they certainly seem to find opportunities to lean into it.
Yeah, the mother in Nightbitch definitely finds a community. She finds a pack, if you like. She starts to realise that maybe there's other women. It's a very funny book in lots of ways. I think there's the other mothers at school, and she starts to think maybe they're also turning into dogs at night, and she calls one of them Big Blonde, and they get these kind of doggy names. It's really quite hysterical, but there's something quite communitarian and empowering about them being able to say, I feel like this is happening to me, this abject bodily, that I'm not in control of. Is it happening to you? And so this kind of discussion that might not happen enough, perhaps, and that's broached by this kind of a change that happens to her physically.
And in both, look to the internet for it. So, there are these experiences they're having personally, they're meeting people, but they're also seeking community in this ether world, to see and validate their experiences.
The mother in Nightbitch discovers Wanda White, this kind of witchy figure who is a holder of feminine wisdom and knowledge. And I kind of see her as like Elizabeth Gilbert kind of figure, maybe, who's got the knowledge, who's got the wisdom. And we never meet her, and the mother really wants to. So maybe she's a magical person again. I just think there's a really fairy tale aspect to this book. But yeah, she thinks there's been knowledge that's been lost for how women should be able to survive these kinds of experiences. And she can't understand why nobody knows what it is that women need to know to make it through this time in their life.
Yes, and it's reinforced. I think there's the book that she gets her hands on, the Field Guide to Magical Women. That's just tickled me so much.
But also, like, how wonderful, like, at last there's some kind of, like, reason and, or maybe it's help, because she's so helpless. And this is, I think, the real shock for the mother, who's been so competent and powerful in her own career, and suddenly is just feeling so alone and so unable to cope with everything that's happening to her. And that the child is an important creation, like a kind of a beautiful, wonderful thing that she's been able to produce and has a role in the life of, but also has changed her in ways that she can't come back from. So where does she go from there? I think it's really interesting as well that the husband in both of these books are quite likeable men.
Absolutely.
So it's not that they're being let down necessarily by patriarchy, although it's quite clear that is also the problem for the women in these contexts.
Also with the bleeding of her night experience into her day experience with her child, but how that almost frees her up to play and frees her from shame around what that should and shouldn't look like. And so there's a real joy in that.
That was such a powerful, like, once she starts becoming less beholden to what she thinks a mother should look like, once she starts going, like, literally finding her animal side or her kind of untapped power, she's able to play. She lets go of the house needing to be clean and, sleep schedules. And she finds a joy she had not been able to access before in her daily lives. But she kind of has to, like, go very, very far and feel like it's, okay to be there and give herself permission for that to happen. It's a beautiful thing for her.
And you read her wrestling with it at times about whether she's damaging the child by allowing them to nest and allowing to meet and eating, like, in certain ways in front of the child.
But also there's the judgment of people around her.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. So she when she starts leaning into, like, her doggy side and they play doggy and doggy together when they're out, she's able to conjure really effectively the kind of pressure that's on mothers to be a certain kind of way.
Yeah, and I found that particularly interesting because some of the play, I mean, yes, she was clearly exacerbating the rough and tumble of some play that you would see with children, but it's the type of wrestling that you tend to see between children or with men and their children, not so much with women. And so I found that interesting as well. It was that next layer of, you know, the freedom for a woman to be dirty and rolling and playing and not considering those limitations. I guess.
I love that. I think that's so true. And so that's what she gains access to. But again, it kind of has to happen through this body horror, you know, kind of magical super. It's not available to her except in this kind of fantastical. And that's maybe like one of the griefs of this book, actually. I think it's an extremely empowering book. But the idea that this can only happen in this kind of realm that's not really real is an interesting kind of problem for the women in these books. Like it's only accessible through kind of extreme transformation that she can't control.
I wonder if that connects to the being of an artist, and that's the reason that it had to be so extreme versus the experience of maybe another person who's it doesn't tap into that creativity so much.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful thing to say. I think that's certainly a big theme for the Miranda July novel.
Yes.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, both of the protagonists of the books are careers as artists. So that particular context, that particular identity and vocation and passion and how it gets squeezed through all kinds of ways, always, but in particularly these kind of experiences.
Now let's go a little bit more into all fours, and purely because they sit next to one another really nicely, but it is quite a contrasting novel in so many ways. In that, I mean, God, it's sexy.
Very much, very much, and in kind of some extreme ways.
Oh God, yeah. It doesn't take long to get into it, and it's very much her experience and her life with her husband, and her relationship with her husband has almost been one of transaction.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so her need to
but the idea as well that they've felt like they're having equal transactions, like it's been a very equal relationship.
Yes.
And they're
absolutely.
like, it's transactional, but we're adults here, and we're, you know, like I make compromise and you make compromise, and they both feel very comfortable with this, and yet she wants more.
Yes. Yeah.
More.
She sleeps in a separate room to her husband. They just have their jobs split nicely. It's like there's a partnership there. There's a friendship there, which is undoubtable throughout the entire story. And part of me throughout this wanted to hear from her husband directly.
Oh, interesting.
Just because it's like a one person's take.
He's such a reasonable person. I feel like he'd be like, whatever you need, darling. And that's kind of part of the problem. Like there is this egalitarianism between them. You know, and in many ways it looks like an ideal relationship, and it, you know, there is a good sort of sense of split with the care, and you know, they've got all the kind of nuts and bolts worked out. I think the beauty of this book is that the protagonist says, I have all this and I want more, and it's not reasonable necessarily, you know, in a kind of objective picture of my life for me to want more, and I want more.
It's interesting because he supports her and sends her off into the world. She sort of sets off on
her road trip
across America and ends up 40 minutes away from home, and that's as far as she gets. But he supported her. He's like, go do it. Find yourself. Do this experience. Find what you need on the road. Yeah. She found what she needed. It wasn't on the road.
Kind of was on the road.
Well, kind of. That's so true. She finds someone that she connects with. She creates a deep friendship within that experience.
Yeah, I think she gets the chance to kind of jump out of her life in a way that is not really feasible or possible for most people. To me, again, that's the kind of fantastical but powerful aspect of this novel. And it's also called an autofiction, which I might raise, because interestingly enough, the character who is the protagonist of this book looks a lot like Miranda July, quite well-known artist, or maybe a moderately well-known artist, It Girl, in a kind of American indie culture, has done a lot of documentary and art film, written short stories, and done some kind of like left-of-field films. So this is very similar to the protagonist in this book, and at points she sort of says, I'm a semi-famous artist, and she gets recognised as such in the book. So she's sort of saying, this is me, this is Miranda July, but it's also fictional in that she imagines this life that is probably not available to her or to anybody and isn't really very viable as a kind of option for exploring yourself. But I found that just so powerful, right? This idea that maybe that's what novels or reading or fiction then also gives to us, like these spaces to imagine realities that aren't possible or plausible, but then you can work things out in and then come back and hopefully, take some of that learning or extreme experience into your own world. And I just feel like both of those books had that as a theme. Nightbitch gets it from her transformation into a dog and roaming in the wild, and Miranda July character, who's also not named, never given a name in this book, gets that from the experience she carves out in the middle of a road trip. A very kind of odd, I don't know, there's some things about it that I will keep thinking about for a long time.
It's still percolating very much in my brain, and I keep going, oh, yeah, I did read that.
And it really aligns to a lot of the kind of art that Miranda July makes, which is very semi-autobiographical, and she does a lot of dancing on her Instagram page, wearing nothing but like pantyhose and underwear. It is that kind of like very extroverted kind of creative artistic life that she's leading. But I think the reason I really, really liked this book is that I think, again, maybe your point about the artist is an important one. And she's sort of saying the artist does need to drive towards experiences that can't be contained in their everyday life. And so that tension, it's not that it's a resolvable tension, but maybe it just needs to be recognised more and understood that it is always going to be a tension. She's got this wonderful life in which to raise the child, but doing that is death to the work. And she doesn't know how to figure this out. And she's left alone in lots of ways to figure it out. And maybe that's a problem for society in general.
And also, part of her experience with the child is very traumatic.
Oh, gosh, yeah. That is extremely traumatic.
It's almost an exploration on how in relationships and how in your life a moment of intense trauma being absorbed into it and it being everything. You drop all other parts of your world and it's a shared experience. Like, so that was something she shared with her husband.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is us against the world and this is the one thing we're thinking about. And then everything else in life that continues on from that moment is in comparison to that experience. And so I feel like that also has a real strong tension throughout this.
Yeah, I listened to an episode of Esther Perel talking to Miranda July, which was really great. They didn't talk a lot about the book necessarily, but it was this idea of how do human beings and individuals in relationships navigate the desiring side with the secure side, right? These two needs that a person in a relationship has. So with the husband, Miranda July's character has shared trauma. They have deep love. They have deep respect and understanding. But she also needs exciting newness and transgressiveness and an eroticness that isn't necessarily available in that relationship. And it's not that they're ever going to be, but like recognizing those competing feelings inside the people in that relationship. And I just thought that was such an interesting insight that Esther Perel gives into, you know, heterosexual relationships. But Esther Perel says it's basically always in relationships. She thinks it crosses all the boundaries. How do two people navigate those competing needs for strangeness and familiarity at the same time?
And it was interesting in here that the narrator is trying to progress establishing that kind of an understanding with her husband. It's like, how do we navigate a future that allows for us to explore these things? But also then her reflections and conversations with other friends going, oh, would you feel like this is something that suits you? And they're like, yeah, I mean, I'm curious and this is great. You know, it reinforces exactly what you're saying, that those living in, again, the regularity and the comfort have curiosity, they have fantasy, they have all of these fabulous things going on in their mind. But when the rubber hits the road, the question is who would actually do it? And I found that a really interesting thought experiment.
Definitely. This book made me think so hard about so many things. And I was surprised because it is kind of, as I said, a bit of an unhinged book. And it's, if you try and describe it to people, it just sounds wacky. Oh, yeah. But it's a deeply philosophical book. And I think she does such a good job of capturing big human questions for people at this time, like how do I be me and also the best version of me and also a contributing member of society and also like love people around me, and you know, these are the huge questions, and she kind of dives straight into all of them and comes out on the other side still saying I don't know, but maybe the asking is the thing. And I think that was, you know, the kind of taking time out or stepping off into something weird and wild is what needs to happen. I'm not sure on the moral of the story, no, if there is one, but I certainly got the sense that for this particular narrator, there was going to be an explosion in their life if they hadn't taken some kind of action to bring it forward into a way that was at least manageable for a little while.
The thing that I also found was being able to have conversations with all sorts of people in their life, their husband, with their friends.
Yeah.
The openness of those
Yeah.
conversations was really, it demonstrated the vulnerability of that
Yeah.
experience of, just going, this is me and this is actually what I want as a human, and so exploring that within this was really interesting, because that can hit right or wrong with different people. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
And also, just her whole thing is, I don't think that there's going to be like a steady moment for this character, but also just, chaos isn't always a bad thing. And that in fact, it's a source of creative power and energy. So how to make all of these things happen at the same time in this frame of the need to live in a real world in which bills have to get paid and the bins have to get taken out and a child needs to get taken to school, and how to negotiate all those existing structures and still be the kind of self that this person wants to be. It's a huge challenge, and I love the questions that are asked by the characters in this book, and the protagonist in particular. And Miranda July herself, I think that is probably her mandate, to ask these provoking kind of questions and present these wacky kind of scenarios that you think that's not possible, and then all of a sudden you go, maybe it is possible actually, breaking down a lot of kind of resistances and barriers. She's wild. It's a really good ride. It's well written, it's pacey, it's tense, it is confronting, I think, in some particular ways.
Absolutely. But I feel like there are rooms you don't open the doors to in a lot of people's lives, and she's happily opening those doors and saying, this is what it looks like in here.
The discussion of messy interiority in someone who is still also successful and is also a good wife and mother, but also, a deeply kind of interestingly transgressive person, and to be all of those things and still, keep going. I guess the main thing that strikes me with this book is she is already happy, but she wants more. And how is that allowed? How do we get the more that we want, no matter how happy you might already seem to be? She seems to have everything, and she still wants more and is going to take it no matter what.
So that was Kylie Cardell, Associate Professor at Flinders University's College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, having a chat with me about Nightbitch by Rachel Yoder and All Fours by Miranda July. And I'm sure listening to that, you probably have more questions than answers, and I encourage you to pick them both up and devour them.
Hi, I'm Nikki. My favourite author is Hilary Mantel. I absolutely love her style and becoming immersed in the world that she writes about. Wolf Hall and Bringing Up the Bodies are my two favourite books. My favourite author that I've discovered via the Libby app, where you can hear books for free if you're a library card owner, is an American author. Her name's Anne Patchett, and she wrote a wonderful book about art and families, and it's called The Dutch House. I also loved her book Tom Lake. She also wrote another one called These Precious Days, and an autobiographical story called Commonwealth. They were great too, but I didn't love her story called Bel Canto. The books I would never read are self-help, although I probably need to. I'm just too arrogant to think that I could get any advice from a self-help book. I think I'm not quite in the demographic for autobiographies just yet. I did enjoy Phil Knight's autobiography about how he formed the company Nike, and that was fascinating, but that's about the only one I've really enjoyed. The others I avoid. One of my big regrets in life is bringing up 3 children, 2 of whom are fully fledged adults now, and none of them read books. None of them. The youngest is 17, and his life and news is via Snapchat and TikTok, and the other 2 never read. They read Harry Potter, and that's about it.
If you want to share with us any high recommendations, any criticisms that might be different to what you've heard here, we'd love to know. Shoot us a line on sundokucast, TSUNDOKUcast @gmail.com, and we'll get right back to you.
It's been lovely sharing these books with you. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Sarah Martin.
Catch you next time.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Kath Keneally,
Michaela Andreev.
Annie Hastwell.
And me, Sarah Martin. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Sundokucast, TSUNDOKU cast.